Hello, I'm Anne Klein, and I teach Buddhism at Rice University, and I'm also co-founder of Dawn Mountain Tibetan Buddhist Center in Houston. And I'm very happy to reminisce a bit today about my relationship with Khetsun Sangpo Rinpoche, which was one of the great blessings of my life, and about Khetsun Sangpo Rinpoche himself, the author of Strand of Jewels. So I met Rinpoche very first time on the road to Kangyur Rinpoche's house in Darjeeling. I was with Harvey Aronson, now my husband, and we had heard of Kangyur Rinpoche in 1971 and wanted to meet him. And Harvey had already studied a little bit with Khetsun Sangpo and had told me wonderful stories about him. So when he pointed off into the distance and said, "That's Khetsun Sangpo," and threw away his cigarette, and as Khetsun Sangpo approached, I just immediately felt, oh, Harvey found such a person to study with. He had, through his whole life, and he lived, and I knew him until he was 90, just a kind of grace, just a kind of, you just felt like there was something soothing and sweet coming out of him. You know, there are some lamas who are like that. And he just had that quality of sweetness to look at, to hear his voice. Once, after not seeing him for a number of years, he called. Phone calls from Nepal are always a challenge. And this one worked, and we could actually hear him very well. And just he said, "Hello, Anila." I was like, why aren't I there? And just his voice was very sweet. After Jeffrey invited him to Virginia, University of Virginia, where he would teach what became his tantric practice in Nyingma, the first book, as far as I know, that was really explaining about the foundational practices, so-called preliminary practices, Ngondro, of the Nyingma tradition. And that was the largest class at that time that had ever been held in the Religious Studies Department of the University of Virginia, over 100 people. And we would sit around the table over tea and chocolate, actually. And it was just a wonderful chance. As many of you may know from your own experience, some of the best times with a teacher are those casual times. It's not a teaching. It's just you being human beings together and really feeling into the kind of human being that teacher is. And so I had a lot of chance to do that. And when he left, he stayed 3 months. And the night we thought he was going to stay 4 or 6 months. So he just suddenly said, "I'm going, like tomorrow." And it was quite an upheaval. And the last night before he left, he read a little bit from his autobiography, which has not yet, I think, been translated into English, actually. It exists in Japanese. And what he happened to read about was a little bit of his experience doing the famous Munkang, the dark retreat, which is a very closely held lineage in Nyingma. And his generation, he and Trulshik Rinpoche, were the only holders of this particular lineage, the essential black Yangtik Napo. And he described how it was for him sitting in the dark, seeing color. And our mouths dropped open. And besides that, there was all that sweetness. It wasn't really, so there's the combination that it was his personal experience, that he himself was reading it, perhaps remembering it, and that we were just kind of in this luminous kind of circle of grace, of entering into that world. We had never heard of such a thing. And then and there, it was very clear that we had to, I know I felt, and Harvey also, okay, we have to, when can we study again? And he said, "Oh, you can study with me again. You have to do Ngondro, and you have to learn Tibetan to speak, because I'm not giving these kinds of instructions through a translator." So, flash forward a number of years, and we did go back to study with the Rinpoche. According to the Longchen Nyingtik, there are things that you study after you do Ngondro. He spent a whole summer teaching us, several hours morning, several hours in the evening. Again, what a privilege, just us two. Again, we got to see him. He had by then just begun, he had founded his school at that time, which is a pretty a rough situation for the students, although they were very happy. They all shared one room, kind of little sleeping bags, lined up one against the other. And actually, we learned that one student, who was then about 16, that our visit there made an impression on him, because he was there. He's dressed as a monk. He really wasn't particularly interested in what he was being taught. And he told us 30 years later, a few years ago, that he was really amazed to see these two Westerners who had come from so far away, who he was too polite to say this, but, for whom it was quite a struggle really to understand Tibetan in the first place, being so interested, and not only that, asking questions. Because the traditional model is you don't ask questions. You sit there and you try to be that perfect vessel for the teacher to pour in Dharma. So he became somebody who asked questions. And many years later, Khetsun Sangpo told us that this is Lama Tenzin Sampel really was his best student. And Lama Tenzin Sangpo has also, he comes yearly now to Dawn Mountain to teach. So we kind of feel like we're kind of continuing things in that way. In 1996, Rinpoche gave a retreat in California, Lama Tarchen's place, in California, on a text that he had written some years earlier on Dzogchen. As far as I know, it is his only Dzogchen text. And it was a wonderful retreat. It was a restricted retreat, and he just poured forth about his understandings of Dzogchen distilled from his teachers, his great teachers, including Lama Gompo, not to be confused with Lama Gompo Tseden, who spent some years in California. This was a teacher who spent most of his life in seclusion, most of his life in caves. And Khetsun Sangpo Rinpoche followed him about for a bit. I should say that Khetsun Sangpo Rinpoche received, so Heart Essence Vast Expanse, the Longchen Nyingtik, is perhaps the most widespread lineage of Dzogchen in Tibet, stemming from Jigme Lingpa, and really stemming from Jigme Lingpa's inspiration through Longchenpa, inspiration going back to Guru Rinpoche. And Khetsun Sangpo Rinpoche received the Longchen Nyingtik transmission from Jetsun Shuksep, who was the great female Dzogchen Ma at that time in the I don't remember the year. So he received Longchen Nyingtik from her, and he also studied extensively with this Lama Gompo, and he was present when Lama Gompo passed away, and his body disappeared virtually, shrank to very small, and perhaps would have disappeared, but his student, who had been told to remain outside for 7 days, got worried and sort of opened the door a little too soon. So some of the body was still there, but still considered a certain type of rainbow body. This was the type of teacher that he had. And his whole ambience was very, very inspiring. And we did go back many times to Nepal to study with him. And he came to the United States when we were at University of Virginia. When I taught at Stanford, we invited him to Stanford. He's visited Rice and our center several times. So in 1996, I had known for a while that he'd written this text on Dzogchen, but didn't know anything about it, really. And he agreed to teach it as a retreat, as I said, as a restricted retreat. And it was just an outpouring of so much wisdom, so much wonderfulness, because it was very experience near. It was very much from the heart, as Dzogchen teachers are. And it was there was a small group, and we knew each other well. And we also had individual meetings, encounters with him. So it really was very, very personal, which is how Dzogchen generally, traditionally, has been taught. And since the retreat was restricted, I assumed that he didn't really want it translated or published, but eventually I timidly kind of asked, what about translating the text. And he said, okay. And then after a few years, he said, get it done. And somewhere in there, I asked him, well, what about the commentary? The commentary, which is also, of course, in the book now, the commentary expands on the text itself. The text itself is, as Tibetan texts often are, is very pithy. And if you're new to some of the topics or new to the landscape of Dzogchen, it might not reveal itself. And certainly, even if you're familiar with the landscape of Dzogchen, it doesn't reveal itself in the way that it does when you hear it explained down-home style with stories and examples from the teacher who lived it and wrote it. So I, at that time, had talked with Sidney Pyburn and Snow Lion and said, I'm going to work on this book and I want it to be really nice, really nice, beautiful book. So he agreed that Snow Lion would publish it. It took me way long to do it. And actually, by the time it was finished, Snow Lion had become Shambhala Snow Lion. So then I had the good fortune of working with Nico and all of the people here, and they carried forward this initiative to have it be quite a nice-looking book, Khetsun Sangpo's picture. And it really, one of my students said the other day that the book itself was sweet. She had heard about Khetsun Sangpo, but she never met him. She'd heard me describe him as sweet. She says, there's just something sweet in the translation itself. Well, if that's true, I'm very pleased. And I discussed it with his student, Lama Tenzin Sampo, whether it should be a restricted book or not, because Khetsun Rinpoche never indicated that it should be. So there's been a kind of journey of this text and teaching of this text from being quite held closely. None of us who received it in 1996 ever talked about it to anybody. And then, 96, 20 years later, it's an offering to everybody, nothing held back. It's all in there. And with the hope that some seed of sweetness, some of my teachers have said, and you may have also heard that, the Dharma, wherever you touch it, it's sweet.